Okay, it looks like we are slowing down now for people coming in. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. It's a really good turnout today for our science communication webinar. So I am Amber, I'm CIEEM's Policy Officer, formerly Policy and Comms. And I'll be joined today by Vicky who I'll introduce properly in a moment, and Jason Reeves, our Head of Policy at CIEEM. So can we go to the next slide, please? So up on screen is what we'll be taking you through today. It's an overview of this massive topic, and we signpost to a lot of further resources. So if you're interested, and we hope this will inspire you to get communicating and reading further. We'll also take you through some more specific examples to get you started, and we'll have a few polls to find out what your aspirations are, and then there will be a Q&A at the end. So please do put any questions in the Q&A function, and feel free to chat away in the chat as well. So we're covering quite a lot today, but this is being recorded and the slides will be available afterwards, so you'll have access to all the hyperlinks and information that we've looked at and included. So before we get going, we've got our first poll, which should be coming up now. There you go. To give us an idea of the type of science communication, if any, that you've taken part in before today. And then we'll be asking you at the end what we've inspired you to have a go at. So please keep that in mind as you go through. If you'd like to go ahead and put in your choices to the poll. I think Christy's going to help me out with this. Okay. Christy, how are we doing for numbers? Are we?
Yeah, nearly there. Yeah, I'll close the poll now and share the results.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so by and large, social media is the biggest one, and I'll come on to that in a second. We also got blogging, video, graphic recording, but we do touch on that, I think, in this webinar. Sci art and other, we've had a few come in about face-to-face presentations, attendance at events, etc. So yeah, it's great to see members and participants today participating in a lot of forms already. So hopefully this won't be entirely new to everyone. Okay, I think that's all closed. So we'll start with the basics. What is science communication? So you're likely well aware of the traditional forms of science communication, including blogs, briefings, talks, and social media. And as we saw from the poll, many of you are. But we've included a few other examples here to whet your appetite for more creative possibilities. And we do invite you to follow up on any that take your fancy. And all the images that will start coming up now are hyperlinked for you. So we have the Stonecrop Review and Consilience, which are journals that provide a place to share creative writing, poetry and art that conveys a scientific message. We have the Poetry of Science podcast and the CIEEM project that offer a home for science poetry. Videos can use stop frame animation based on cutouts or Lego for a fun way of engaging. And we'll be looking more at making videos of your own work later. We have cartoons and comics that can draw in a really diverse audience, and you don't need to be an artist. For some of these, there's been some very successful accounts that just use stick figures, for example. And then we have the more traditional forms of artwork, crochet, cakes, and the endless list that you can take. So you don't have to be a creative person to convey your science in an engaging way, but this does just show you the range of possibilities when it comes to getting your message out there to a wide audience. So on the next slide, we look at why do science communication? Because it works, and if you put your content out there in a less formal way on blogs and social media platforms, you will get your message out to a wider range of people, and that can lead to real world impacts. Let's not forget that policymakers and other scientists are people too, so making your communication engaging and using good visuals makes it much more likely that your message will get where it needs to go to have influence. We have a nice snippet on screen here of how effective science communication can be, with publications receiving more attention on social media and in traditional media, reaching a really diverse non-scientific group than those with a lower media profile. So on the next slide, we'll look at how you can get started. So before you start actually sharing your message, it's really important to identify and be specific about a few key aspects. Firstly, what do you want to achieve with your science communication? Do you have a call for action, or are you just sharing something cool that you want people to get excited about? Be clear about why you are communicating. Next is, who is your audience, and are they science literate? You could be putting things out for general consumption, or you may be communicating to other professionals and policymakers in your discipline and other disciplines. So this will really affect the type of language you use and what jargon you can safely get away with, although it's best to avoid too much jargon in any setting, as this can be very specific and may not mean much to people outside of your specific field. Next, you want to be really clear about your core message and try to have just one core message in each piece of communication, or at least limit it as much as possible, and just be really clear about these. And then you need to know why you're putting your message out. So look at it from your audience's point of view as well as your own. What will they get out of receiving your message and acting on it potentially? And finally, is your message time critical? Does it link to your clash with other events happening? And what time of day would your audience be most receptive to receiving your message? And finally, what does success look like? Is it number of likes on a social media post, or bookings on an event, or names on a petition? So at CIEEM, for an example, on the time of day, we did an analysis of the best days and times to post on our different social media channels, which showed some interesting differences. So Facebook favours later in the week and weekends, LinkedIn favours midweek, and Twitter is popular throughout most of the week. And there was also some big differences in time of day to post on these different channels as well. So next, consider how you'll put your message out there. What format and platform will best serve your message? Social media. So this could be Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, others. We won't go into too much detail on that today because we have a lunchtime webinar tomorrow solely dedicated to using social media and creating your own personal brand. So you can book onto that on our website. You could also write blogs for your employer, or for CIEEM, we have our own blog that we host member blogs on, or for your own personal blog. And we'll talk more about structuring blogs later on. You can make videos to share via YouTube or CIEEM, and we'll talk more about that as well. Or you could be speaking live or online for events and webinars. In any case, good visuals will increase engagement. And we'll be talking about photographs, graphic recordings, and infographics to support your message. So now I'm going to hand over to Vicky to look at some of these topics in more depth. Vicky is a PhD researcher at the Open University, but before that, she was CIEEM's volunteer coordinator and my colleague. And as well as being a scientist, Vicky is a writer and illustrator who has explored many ways of communicating her research, and she'll be sharing some of what she's learned along the way. So over to you, Vicky.
Great, thanks very much, Amber. We move on. There we go. Okay, so next we're going to look at the importance of story. Why does story matter in your communications? Well, we're story-driven creatures. We've been conveying information through stories for 100,000 years. So we're wired to understand and remember things that are delivered in the format of a story. We've been using visuals to do that for 27,000 years and writing them down for 3,500 years. So these are truly ancient disciplines compared to PowerPoint, which has been around for about 20 years. So things have moved on. So story matters, and wrapping your facts in a story is how you can make your science memorable. And that doesn't necessarily mean weaving fiction around your science. It means delivering information in a deliberately structured way that engages with our innate love of story. And this can work on the scale of a tweet or a whole thesis and everything in between. So what's your story? Well, every story has a spine that could look something like this. It gives the story a shape and ensures that it's revealed in a logical and compelling order. And there are different types of archetypal story that are suited to different types of message that you might be wanting to convey. So here are just some examples and what sort of environmental story they might suit. If you want to find out more about this, check out some of the linked resources. It's a really fascinating topic when you dig into it. Now, depending on the size and complexity of your story, you could begin by mapping out your story using a written synopsis or a mood board with images of what you might want to include, or a storyboard of thumbnail sketches that show the sequence of events. So planning is really important. It's true that a picture can speak 1,000 words, so make sure you use them, but you'll probably need some words as well. So you need to make sure that you use those well. Think about your key story points. What are the main events of your story? Pay attention to the pace and the rhythm. Vary the timing as you go to keep it interesting. Keep it moving, but use pauses and breaks to build suspense. Think about your story arc. What were things like before? What happened? And how did that change things? Or how could that change things? Different types of story will have a different shape in terms of the rise and fall of action. Here's just one example, but it will depend on the type of story that you're telling. So try sketching out how yours plays out. Try and use short sentences rather than long compound sentences, and avoid jargon. Don't make your audience work too hard to follow you, or you risk losing them in the content heavy world that we're in. And try reading them out loud for flow and tone. Use a test audience if you can, even if it's just the cactus on your desk or a handy cat or something. It really helps to read them out. So stories speak to the emotional part of our brain. Much environmental messaging is inherently negative, focusing on species loss, habitat loss, environmental degradation. And that's important, but the negativity can turn your audience away or make them feel powerless to do anything about it, and therefore unwilling to listen to what you've got to say. And this has been a big problem in the global crises we're now facing. And studies confirm that simply bashing people over the head with more facts simply doesn't work for most people, no matter how clear or compelling that fact may appear to you. George Marshall talks about this in length in his book, Don't Even Think About It, which is linked at the bottom. And this quote captures the need to deliver that data-driven evidence to the emotional brain through stories. But how do you do that? How can you do as George Marshall suggests and turn base data into emotional gold? So we need to think about the emotional brain here. So positive messaging, engaging people with story, is a much more effective way to empower action. We've already talked about how long we've been wired for story, and it helps to understand what's going on in our emotional brains when we hear a story. So looking at this graphic, it's easy to see where we are most comfortable. Over on the left, bathing in oxytocin, feeling safe and calm. When you're telling a story, you can tap into this area by creating cute characters that we can have empathy with. There's a reason why cat videos are so popular, and why cute, charismatic species are easier to get people to care about in conservation stories than ugly ones or small ones that you can't see. But when things are going well, we'll mosey on up into serotonin. We're feeling good, motivated, curious. A good story can hook our attention here. And dopamine is a great place for problem solving. So we're focused, we're motivated, we're receptive to new information that we're more likely to remember. In storytelling, you can exploit this area through tension and suspense. So we need to know what happens next to keep the story going. On over into noradrenaline, and we're prepared to act urgently. There's a sense of pressure. A good story will get you here before moving you back towards a resolution. But if we're sliding down towards adrenaline, we're maybe starting to panic. We're no longer really taking in new information or remembering anything. Well, our brains just focus down on simply how to run away from a tiger. And if we go as far as cortisol, we could be into some serious stress, anxiety, and panic. This isn't a place where we can really absorb new information or plan meaningful actions. And we've probably all got experience of landing here at some point and know how motivated we are to simply make that long recovery crawl back over to oxytocin so we can feel safe again. And the problem with a lot of environmental communication about the big things like climate change and biodiversity loss are that experts have gone in with deeply concerning data on that right-hand side and just tried to keep peppering people with facts. I mean, it seems logical, right? You know, if people had the facts, why wouldn't they change their behavior? But we know that doesn't work because as a species, we're not logical creatures. Different groups will have different areas of attention and confirmation bias, and not everyone's motivated by graphs and statistics. An anecdote may well work better. So try engaging at the level of values rather than facts. To be powerful influencers, we need to engage hearts, heads, and hands in a variety of ways. It can be more effective to lead people through it with a story. Begin over towards the left by giving them something to care about, whether that's a person or a species they can relate to. Give it relevance to them, not just a distant abstract problem. Tell them about it and why it's important. Show them a positive outcome that they can become invested in. Unfolding it as a story will help them to follow you up the hill. When they're in that alert, resourceful state at the top, you can hit them with a call to action. or ask them to come up with one for themselves. Involve your audience, and they may think of things that you haven't. You've made them care. Now show them what they can do about it to help reach a positive outcome. You can lay on a bit of pressure towards the right or foreshadow what it would be like to get there, but be careful not to tip your audience too far into an unresourceful state on the downhill. Show them how to get back to the top where they can take meaningful actions and feel some degree of control. Provide something positive to aim for rather than simply threats to avoid. Of course, people are all different and will all react differently to information, but keeping this basic principle in mind can help you use the power of story to influence your audience. Now, pictures are really important in effective communication, and they can have a strong and immediate influence on the emotional brain. So I'm going to show you in a moment 3 images of great crested newts, and I want you to notice just how they make you feel within a couple of seconds of seeing them. So here we go. So how are we feeling about those? So the first image on the left is very factual. There's no colour, and it does effectively convey the features of interest, but through clear labelling. The second image is much more decorative. The composition is pleasing, and we'll be coming back to that in a bit. It's a warm, colourful image, but it's still factual. Colours have an important part in visual communication. As humans, we've evolved strong colour vision, which is likely a foraging advantage. So we respond to colour. The third image is very different. It has a similar colour palette, but it has much more character. It does commit that scientific crime of anthropomorphizing your subject, but those big eyes in the pose make it relatable and able to hook the interest of the emotional brain. There's also some storytelling, visual storytelling going on here, as the newt has a companion and is carrying out an activity. So all these images will be exactly right in different circumstances. You probably wouldn't want to be using cartoons in a scientific paper or policy document, but the diagram won't grab much attention on social media. So think about the purpose of your communication when selecting images for it. So another great form of visual communication is for science is graphic recording. And I know from the poll there that some of you have had a go at that. So something like 65% of people are primarily visual learners, and including both visuals and words as you do in graphic recording covers a wide range of learning styles. This is often done live at conferences and events, but it can be just as effective for recorded events or to summarize an article or concept in a visual and an accessible way. So on the top left here is an example from Holly Draws. You might well be familiar with Holly's work from places like the BES magazine, The Niche. Below that is one I did for a conference last month. And the aim is not to be too wordy or to take complete minutes of an event, but to record the big picture ideas and the takeaways in an engaging and visual way. Then it can just be a fun way to let your eyes explore the topic afterwards. On the right is a sketch note from Mike Rhodes. A sketch note is basically a smaller graphic recording covering just one idea rather than a whole event. And Benjamin Fellis there at the bottom has a brilliant YouTube playlist which will teach you how to do graphic recording, starting with just drawing lines and squares and building up from there. So again, you don't need to be an artist. You can build these up from basic principles. And if you like this format, there's a ton of resources out there on the web. So do have a search through YouTube and the wider web if you want more examples and tutorials. And have a go next time you're at an event. And remember, you don't need to show anyone what you've done, and if you don't want to afterwards, just have a go. So, thinking now more about words and pictures, writing blogs is a great way to get your message out in a way that will appeal to a wider audience than scientific papers and professional reports or policy documents. And there are a variety of places where you can place a blog when you've written it. It could be the CIEEM blog, as Amber mentioned, your employer or university website, or if you want to write regularly and have that more control over what you're posting, you can set up your own personal blog site. And these can be free and easy to do. So think about who you want to reach when you're deciding where to place your blog, which audience are you targeting. But wherever you place it, you'll need to shape your story well. So here's a few tips to help you do that. So generally, less is more, and £1,000 is about the maximum you'd want to aim for. You can afford to be quite informal and use an active first-person voice here. Write it as you'd say it. Think about your positioning. If you use you, you're speaking to other people, that doesn't include you. And if you say we, that does include you and promotes a sense of community. So decide how you want to place yourself in relation to your audience and be deliberate in your choice of language. Now try to avoid saying things like obviously or as we all know. Don't assume anything because you don't know who your reader is and this could disengage them. People want you to help them to feel smart, not outsmarted. Again, using shorter sentences over long compound sentences, and make sure your paragraphs flow and signpost where the story is going. So that's language. Thinking about structure, you can start with a provocative title. That doesn't mean that you don't need to be sensationalist, but use a title that conveys what the article is about and makes it sound interesting and important. You could pose a question here, but don't give a solution. The lead paragraph is next, and that's one of the most important bits. It tells the reader what the article is about and why they should read more. Now, many readers will never read past this, so this is your chance to hook them in. Try looking at the opening paragraph of newspaper and magazine articles and notice how much they tell you in that first paragraph and what it is about them that makes you want to read on, if you do. Give your call to action here, but before expanding on it in the main body, bearing in mind that the majority of readers will never read all the way to the end. And then comes the main body of the blog. This is where you roll out your story. Make it logical and compelling. Use subheadings and pull quotes to break it up though. Most people will scan read, so help them to pick out the bits that you really want them to take away. And the tail, yes, the tail is the final sort of summary where you sum up what you've talked about, and you can restate that call to action for those that did get to the end. And you can end with a short author biography of maybe 50 words, plus your contact details if that's what you want to do. But the final crucial move is to get it proofread, or leave it a few days and proofread it yourself with fresh eyes. So this is just a few guidelines. There's a lot of resources out there. I've linked a couple of things at the bottom if you want to read more into this area. So we're going to put words and pictures together now and think about making some videos. So it's never been easier to make your own videos to share on social media and YouTube. Obviously, you can get fancy equipment if you've got the interest and the budget, but we're going to talk today more about how you can make you get good results with just yourself and your smartphone, and maybe a few affordable additions if you want to. So I've made a few short videos about my meadows research since summer 2020, having never done it before that. So I'm going to talk here about a few things that I've learned along the way that I wish I'd known up front. I've linked a couple of my videos at the bottom. I won't play them now, but if you want to have a look at those later, the links will be in the PDF slides that we'll send out. And I think Christy's going to add them in the chat as well if you want to get them from there. So to start with, you'll want a script. My first video one that I've linked there was 3 minutes long, and that was 483 words, just to give you an idea of how many words you'd be looking at. Even if you don't want to read from your script, writing one will help you prepare your thoughts and to think about what footage you might want to collect and to tidy up your subtitles. So adding subtitles to your video is important for accessibility, and we're going to come back and talk to that in more detail shortly. But it also helps your search rankings because web bots will read subtitle text and it will help people find your videos. Bear in mind that most videos are watched on phones as well with the sound off, so subtitles are essential for that reason as well. Now, YouTube can create auto subtitles, but they struggle with names and technical terms, which obviously we have a lot of in ecology, but they can be quite entertaining as well. For example, when I added them to this video, it introduced me as Vicky Buzzkill, which was hilarious, but obviously I corrected it before I put it out. So you need to plan time to go through and correct your subtitles, and having a script already written out can make that much quicker. So storyboarding, it's a good idea to do this, to plan out beforehand what footage you want to collect, especially if you're going to be on site and it might not be that easy to go back and get anything that you've missed. And check your phone settings before you start. Higher quality settings will obviously give you a better result, but they can massively increase the file size. So you need enough memory, or your phone needs enough memory to cope with that. Might require a little trial and error. Think about how you want to frame your scene. Do you want it horizontally or vertically? What's in the background? And do wipe the lens before you start and engage airplane mode to avoid being interrupted by calls while you're recording. It's best not to use a digital zoom, as that lowers the resolution of your image, unlike an optical zoom that uses lenses to magnify the image. It's also good to get some cutaway shots of people perhaps walking past the camera or something to use as transitions. And you can notice how they do things like that on programs like Countryfile to take you from scene to scene. So this adds like visual interest and can be a good way to add a human presence, especially if you don't want to actually speak to the camera. So think about ways that you can give your viewers some visual variety in the footage to hold their interest, so it's not all just flat shots of the same meadow or something like that. Light is really important. Where's it coming from and how's that going to affect your footage? Different phones will handle light in different ways. The phone I used for the example videos was quite an old one, struggled a bit with challenging lighting conditions. It was fine, kind of broad daylight, but earlier or later in the day it was a little bit grainier. But yeah, you just need to get to know your own equipment really. You can use artificial light sources or reflectors to have a play around and see what works in the setting that you need to take footage in. Now sound, this was one of the first hurdles I ran into. So I was in my meadow with my camera and my script. I'd set up my phone pointing at a nice patch of oxeye daisies. I walked into shot, crouched down and started speaking. It was all going great. But it was a breezy day and the interference on my phone mic meant I could barely be heard. It may have worked on a really still day, but if you want to speak outdoors, there are a few options that you can use. You could purchase the clip-on lapel mic with the fluffy windbreaker to help with windy conditions. Of course, much fancier microphone kit is available, but I didn't have access to any of that at the time. So I opted to ditch speaking to the camera and do a voiceover recorded at home later. And if you've ever done this, you may know how easy it is to come out sounding like you're in a box, giving a real disconnect between the outdoor footage and the very indoorsy sounding audio. And it's because you're sat at a desk surrounded by hard surfaces and they all reflect the sound back to your microphone. But there's an easy fix for this. It is, I've discovered, the best excuse ever to build yourself a blanket fort. You basically need to surround yourself in soft surfacing. So some people advocate just putting a duvet over your head. But I found that, I did try it, I found that meant I couldn't see my script and it was really hard to kind of sit up and speak properly from my diaphragm. If you make yourself some kind of blanket fort, surrounding yourself in those soft surfaces, surrounding both yourself, your phone or microphone and your script, you'll end up with a much better result. Or you could also try building an open fronted cube with the foam egg box tiles. They're quite cheap to buy, the sort of ½ meter square type ones that you can build. And you can put your phone or your microphone inside that and hang a soft surface behind you. So that will also work quite well. While we're talking about sound, you may want some music or sound effects. There are a number of sites where you can get free or paid for sound, and you just need to check it if there's any attribution required when you use it. I've got a slide at the end of this webinar that's got a selection of links to those kind of libraries, so we'll come back to those. I also recorded some ambient meadow sounds from a more sheltered spot that I added to the voiceover to help it sound kind of connected to the visual. So we just have a little sort of bird song going on and things. So you can think about doing that. So moving on to supporting equipment, I use just a cheap tripod that cost me about £15. I also have one of those shorter ones with the bendy legs. They're quite handy for adapting to rough surfaces or clinging onto objects and things when you're out in the wilds. For moving shots, you can use a gimbal for kind of smooth panning. These could set you back over £100, but they allow you to pan smoothly and to keep the horizon level and to reduce that sickening shake that you can get on hand taken footage. So they're well worth it if you want to do that kind of thing. I didn't have one when I did this video, but I got one later and it's brilliant. One thing to note though is that if there's a lot of movement in your footage, your phone may struggle to cope with it. I found if I was panning across in a meadow where also there were a lot of plants that were blowing about in the wind, my phone really couldn't cope with that much movement, so it came out kind of jerky in places. So it depends on your phone and the settings that you've selected. But if you find that's a problem, you might want to go for still shots rather than moving ones, and that might work better for you. So once you've taken your footage, you'll want to do something with it. You can do kind of basic editing in your phone, but if you want to do something more with it, there are a number of options. I used for these videos Window Movies Maker, Movie Maker Pro, which cost me about £10. The Movie Maker on its own is free, but didn't really do very much, so I needed the Pro version. It's quite limited in its functionality, but it was simple, and it did everything I needed to just trim my shots, arrange them, lay over the music and the voiceover, and to export that finished video. Now I use DaVinci Resolve Studio. Now they have a free version and a paid for version. I've only used the free version, so I don't know what's extra in the paid for version, but it's a really powerful piece of software and well worth learning if you want to get into this. I'd recommend that. I do check out Science Story Lab, which is linked at the bottom, and they've got loads of advice and resources on making science videos, and they've got full run-throughs on a range of software options, including the DaVinci Resolve and Adobe and others. So that will give you some ideas of what you want to learn. And one important thing that I hadn't considered was the length of my video. So I'd made my 3-minute video, uploaded it to YouTube, got my subtitles sorted, went to share it on Twitter. And what I hadn't realized until that point is that if you want to embed the video in a tweet, there's a length limit of 2 minutes and 20 seconds. So I was a bit too long for that. Now I could share it with a link out to where it was in YouTube, but videos that can be played within Twitter get much higher engagement. So my future videos were all short enough to do that. So with the link out to YouTube, I can't remember exactly, but it was National Meadows Day and I got something like 50 views, whereas when I embedded a shorter one in a future tweet, it was within a day it was over 1,000. So there's quite a difference in the number of views with those. So I mean, for Instagram, there's a 30-second limit. I'm not sure about other platforms. So you just want to, if you've got somewhere specific that you want to post it, do check in advance if there's a length limit. And remember really that in our content heavy world, wherever you post it, you're best to keep your videos short and put any call to action up front, because again, half of viewers won't get to the end. And you've only got about 20 seconds to grab people, kind of if that really, as people kind of scroll on past in their Twitter feed or wherever. Oh, too soon. So another, just to mention another style of video, for the video 2, I've got linked at the bottom there. I opted to sidestep some of these issues by having no speaking at all. I had text on screen and a chirpy music track that gave it quite a different feel. And also that one was 2 minutes and 20 seconds to share on Twitter. So there are different style options to choose from to suit your message and to deal with any challenges that you might come across. So that's quite a brief run through really on making videos. I know CIEEM is keen to share videos that people have made in the field, highlighting what their role's like for early career members. So if you've been inspired to have a go, it'd be brilliant if you could get in touch with Christy Hamilton, as she can give you further guidance on how to do this. So moving on now to think about still images, and I'm going to hand you over to Jason.
Thanks, Vicky. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. So my name is Jason Reeves. I'm CIEEM's head of policy. And clearly then I'm not a professional photographer, but I am what you'd call an enthusiastic amateur. So Vicky's asked if I'd share some information on some of the things that I've learned over time, taking photographs and things that might help in storytelling. So I'm just going to run through a few things. So Vicky, if you could pop up the first list of bits and pieces. There we go. Yeah. So I think the first thing to think about in photography is light. Definitely light, light, light. Anyone you talk to in photography, it's all about light. So think about how dark it is where you're taking a photo, or how light it is. Sometimes too light can be a disadvantage as well. Think about the contrast between light and dark as well. Generally, better light, and I'll come back to that, is better for photos. So that means more light. But at the same time, direct light, like full bright sunshine, is generally not good for photographs, but a good amount of light means the sensors are having an easier time picking up light and will generally make a better photo. If you're outside, noonday sun generally isn't the best. So think about taking something earlier in the day or later in the day and get what's called the sort of golden hour if you really want that soft, warm light in the very first thing in the morning and in the evening. Also think about the direction of light where you're coming from. Vicky touched on this for video. The same principle applies for photography. Something to be aware of when you take a photo as well, and cameras are getting better all the time, but they still don't have the same dynamic range that the human eye does. So when you look at a scene, you can see things in the dark area and in the light area. Your camera won't be able to pick up all of that if there's a really high contrast between the two of them. So just think about what you're taking a photo of. Think about the composition and framing of your photos as well. Think about what's in them, what you want to be in them, what you don't want to be in them. So if you're taking a photo and it has a subject and then has a background, is the background adding something to that photo? Is it giving it context? Is it what you call an environmental photo? And that means is your subject in its environment rather than our interpretation of environment? Is it adding a story? Is it putting it in a place or in a landscape? Think about that. Think about things that you don't want in your photo. Are they distractions? You know, would moving 2 feet to your right and turning your angle slightly, you know, remove that distraction? Think about that. Also think about the level in which you take photos from. So if there is a fungi that's 2 inches off the floor, get down on the floor and take a photo from 2 inches off the floor. It'll be a much better photo than you standing above it and taking a photo straight down onto it. Really think about what you want your audience to focus on when you take a photo. What is it that you want to draw their attention to? Make sure that's the most prominent part, and often the brightest part of your photo as well. And in terms of composition and framing, also think about the rule of thirds, and I'll come back to an example of that so that I can explain a bit more about what that really means. And then getting it right in the camera is really important if you can do this first time. So things like if you have a skew horizon and you have to fix it afterwards, means you have to crop the image, or if you've got something in your image that you don't want to be there and you crop that out as well. Every time you crop your image, you reduce the resolution, you reduce the quality of the image. If something is too dark or too light and you're having to change the exposure afterwards as well, that also affects the quality of the image. So try and get whatever you can right in camera, and then you don't have to fix it afterwards. Permissions as well, something to think about when you're taking photos. So if you're on private land, you may need to ask for permission to take photos. Just consider that. If you're in a public space, you're free to take photos, but you do need to consider what you do with them. So if you're taking photos that have identifiable people in them, and you want to then use that photo publicly, you will need to get permission from that person. And if that's something commercial, you definitely need something that's called a model release form agreement. If it's more for illustrative purposes, it's generally best to get something in writing to say you can use that image. So there's just some things to consider there. If we move on then, so all of those principles work for a mobile phone, and mobile phones have come on brilliantly and they're improving all the time. But if you want to think about moving on and getting a dedicated camera, there's a few more things to think about. And as I say that, mobile phones are coming along as well, and there are manual controls within mobile phones as well now. But if you really want to step up your photography, it is best to get a dedicated camera. The lenses are better, and then sensor size is just the big thing. Mobile phones just don't have sensors that are that big, whereas a dedicated camera has a decent sensor size. It can suck in loads of light. So just think about that. When you do have control over the image you're taking, understanding the exposure triangle is something that's really important and really great if you're going to go into sort of a manual mode on how you take your photo. So that's the aperture, the shutter speed, and the ISO. So aperture is the depth of field. Shutter speed is how long the shutter is open for. So if you've got something that's moving really fast and you've got a long shutter speed, it'll be a blur across the screen. And then ISO is the speed of the sensor. It comes from film though. So in the old days, if you had film in your camera, whatever the ISO was rating on the film, you were stuck with it. Digital now, you can play with that and you can actually adjust it. So it's something that's really great. In low light conditions, you can up the ISO and then you still have control over the shutter speed and the aperture. So something just to think about if you've got that manual control and something that you're happy to play with. Depth of field is something that's really great to play around with if you really want to get focus on something, and we'll come back to some examples of that. A tripod, Vicky mentioned this. It's really great if you're taking an image and you want the highest possible quality. It takes it out of your hands. You know, I like to take photos. I don't have the steadiest of hands, so tripod really helps for me, but it doesn't have to be a tripod. You know, you can put it on a table. You can use one of the bendy leg little tripods, mini tripods like Vicky mentioned. Anything where you set it up and it's stable, you get a clearer shot, cleaner shot, crisper. If you're going to use a dedicated camera, filters are something to consider as well. And I know there's filters in mobile phones, but they tend to be digital and they're add-on. This comes back to that point about getting it right in the camera. Polarizing filters are brilliant for outdoor, particularly landscape photography. Anything that involves water or clouds or reflections can really improve your photography. So something to think about there. Coming back to the light, Vicky mentioned this around using reflectors or dedicated lights. So for stills, think about flash if you need to fill in some light. If you can get that flash off your camera, even better. You know, there's a opportunity there to use your tripod to put the flash on that and take some flash from the side. But yeah, if you need to use a flash or a reflector to get additional light, think about that. Post-processing, so another thing that Vicky talked about in terms of video, some of the principles apply for photography as well, can really add something to your imagery, particularly sort of increasing the contrast, bringing out that pop in your images. I particularly like Adobe Lightroom, but there are others available. And there are actually apps as well now for your phone. So if you're taking pictures on your phone, you can go in and edit them in a way that can do the same thing, not to the same extent, but you can do the same thing. And then the two last points around understanding your equipment and then practicing is just, you know, the more time you can spend using your camera and the better you understand it, the better the photos are going to be. It just takes time. So yeah, you know, have a play, spend your time on it. Yeah, so some examples. So the first image we've got here with the beach and the sea, it's a really nice photo, but if you look at the horizon, you'll see that it's skew. And one of the things that, so when I looked at this image, is that if you were to correct that horizon, you'd have to rotate the image slightly and then you recrop it. And one of the things that you might potentially lose is this really nice curve of the land that comes from the right, goes down to the bottom left and then back round. It's a really nice framing element to it. But in cropping it, you might actually lose that little bit just below the beach, which connects it all together. So you might lose something of that image. But otherwise, actually, it's a really nice photo. And it illustrates the point on the right as well, that really nice, I'm not sure with the photo, well, either of them actually, whether they're morning or evening, but that soft, warm light you get at the beginning and the end of the day is really nice. And I suspect with that second photo as well, that they've actually used a polarizing filter to get that really nice reflection of the water. So just some examples there. So this is rule of thirds. Generally, the principle is that you would divide up your image into 3 by 3 and use a grid there. And there's two things to think about here. One is the points on each of the thirds, and then also the lines. So where this animation of a girl is, her head's on a point of third, and then her torso runs through that third line on the axis. And actually, this one's a really nice illustration where you've got her head, her torso, and then her legs almost point along the third horizontally as well. So you've got vertical and horizontal. It just creates a really pleasing effect, I suppose, for the image, rather than it just being smack bang in the middle of your camera image. Something to think about when you are using the rule of thirds, though, is around empty space and how it's working. So in this image, you'll see that she's actually looking up, I suppose, in a way, but she's looking into that open space. So always consider if you have an animal or a person that they're looking into space rather than having that space behind them. If you're thinking about it in terms of, for example, a plant, sometimes that can be taken or used in a way where if it's bending one way, but bending into the space rather than bending out of the space. So just some things to think about there with the rule of thirds. It doesn't work for everything, but it creates a really nice effect and a pleasing effect that for our human brain, somehow we really like. But yeah, it's just something to consider in composition. And then here's just some depth of field that is another one that's really pleasing on the eye. So that really soft focus, the bokeh as it's called in the background, we find is a really pleasing effect. but what it does is also really pops out the image, the subject that you want to focus on. So even though, for the example, the image on the right, they've put that subject, the flower pot with the flowers, the pink flowers, right on the right hand side, you're drawn to it just because it's the only thing in focus. But then you get this really nice, pleasing background. It does also create the opportunity for you to use that other space if you're going to use it for text or some other, diagram or something like that you can put into that space. So things like that. You'll have a lot more control over things like this with the depth of field in a manual control, so with a dedicated camera. Mobile phones can do some of this now. There are special effects that will do it digitally. It doesn't always get it right, but there is that option in there as well. So yeah, so just some tips from me on photography, and I'll pass you over now to Amber. Thanks.
Thank you, Jason. And I'll just start on infographics and policy engagement. And before I do, I have to apologise. There is a chainsaw in the background, which is a prime example of science communication and something to think about before you start. So apologies if that's distracting at all. So yeah, so policy engagement, utilising your expertise to engage with policy making and influencing change is another area of science communication that requires a whole different style. So we do actually have 2 webinars dedicated to how you might actually get involved with influencing policy as an ecologist or environmental manager, and these are happening in December. So please do sign up if you would like to explore this in more detail, and there are links on the screen there. But for now, we'll just focus on how you might get your message across to this type of audience. So firstly, it really does depend on the situation. You might be invited to give evidence to a parliamentary committee or a government working group, in which case you'll have much more time to explain concepts and evidence. Or you might be responding to a public consultation, which generally involves answering set questions and providing links to further evidence wherever possible. However, there are also less formal ways of getting your point across that allow for more creativity in policy engagement. So in any case, it's important to remember that politicians are incredibly busy people and are often briefed on a huge range of topics every single day. And sometimes they can be very knowledgeable on a subject if they take a particular interest. However, often concepts are quite new to them, and so the usual advice of avoiding jargon and explaining things really clearly and concisely applies here as well. So in policy engagement and communicating with politicians, building a relationship is essential. So this can be with the politicians themselves, or with the civil servants of the government, or with parliamentary staff. So staff of parliamentarians and civil servants are usually doing most of the work on finding evidence and developing policies behind the scenes. So you can start with your local MP, maybe offer your expertise or ask for a meeting or invite them along to an event you might be holding. Here you can highlight the key findings of your research or project and the implications that the findings have for policy or legislation. Always finish with really clear asks of them as an individual. So MPs can raise questions for you in Parliament, for example, or bring something up with a parliamentary committee. And then outline the change that needs to happen. And in any case, don't forget to frame your message around current pressing issues, public opinion, or recent announcements, for example. So as I said earlier, politicians are often fighting fires and dealing with big issues of today. So if you can link it to those, that's a really great place to start. Or better yet, if you have an understanding of the individual's area of interest and can find common ground, that will really help engage them in the issue as well. And you might do this by looking on their website and seeing what groups they're part of, or what topics they're promoting on their website, or looking at what questions they've raised in Parliament in the past, which you can do on the parliamentary website for whichever country you're in. One form of group that an MP might be part of that would show what they're interested in is all party parliamentary groups. And CIEEM runs the secretariat for the APPG for nature. And we have 10 members of Parliament there. So there's a clear indication they're very interested in nature. So you may also wish to get in touch directly with the parliamentary committee and the parliamentary committee staff that run relevant inquiries and offer your information on this as well. So next, just to look at briefings and infographics. So short briefing papers and infographics, which are a visual representation of information or data, are a really great way of reminding the individual politician or staff of key facts and asks after a meeting you've had with them, or for allowing them to share it more widely with their own contacts. So a well-known example is the State of Nature report. The infographics for this are pictured in the centre there. And this is a regular report of how this country's wildlife is faring, looking back at over 50 years of monitoring to see how nature has changed in the UK. The key findings are presented as infographics, such as the one in the slide, and publicised widely. These figures are regularly quoted and have been raised in Parliament a number of times. So that just goes to show how effective they are. And they have a lot of data to make into a concise message, so they do very well there. And another key example is the Red List for Britain's mammals, created by the Mammal Society in 2020. This was published alongside the striking infographics that you can see on the left on the slide. We might not always be able to create something this complex with the resources that we have, but it highlights the importance of visualizing facts and figures. This is much more accessible to someone who has 5 minutes between meetings and sittings in Parliament than a long paper. At CIEEM, we often produced briefing papers summarising key policy issues and outlining key areas of change. An example is shown on the right here with the first page of our briefing on nature-based solutions. So we would normally pull this together with our members through our policy committees that we have, and we'd send this to our contacts in Parliament, government and statutory bodies, depending on who it's aimed at. In these briefings, we use a lot of bullet points and we put our key messages in bold and generally decorate them with relevant photographs just to make it more appealing to the eye than a long paper. So I've included some links on the previous slide for resources on visualizing data, but ultimately make sure any data you're presenting is clear and accompanied with the story of why it matters and what needs to change. So thank you. I'll hand over to Vicky again.
That's great. Thanks, Amber. Okay, some important things to think about in our communications. We should all be aiming to make our communications as accessible and inclusive as possible. Hopefully that goes without saying. There are a lot of different aspects to consider and a wealth of resources online to help you, but here are a few key things for you to think about. The easy one is to use plain language. It's back to that avoiding jargon thing, and that will help everyone. So when it comes to text formatting and colour choices, you can't be completely inclusive when it comes to this. For example, dyslexic readers may need a low contrast and really struggle with black text on white, but partially sighted readers will specifically need that very high contrast. And many users, if you have difficulties, will have local settings of their own on their laptop or device to help them. So alternative formats may be required, depends on the communication, maybe not for a tweet, but for longer things, you might need more than one format to be accessible for everyone. But there are some basic things you can do for good practice. And the infographics there are linked through to some posters on, there's one for various different disabilities to give you some ideas of how to be accessible for those. But on the text and formatting and colour choices, just make sure you use a large enough font for the context of your communication. If you use sans serif fonts like Arial or Calibri, these are easier to read. Avoid using italics or underline for large sections of text. They can be quite difficult to read. Avoid that double justified text because it creates variable spaces between words that can be difficult for dyslexic readers. Break up large pieces of text with subheadings and supporting images, and that helps everyone. And there are many types of colour blindness, but you can choose a palette that will work for most people. But do avoid using too many clashing colours to be inclusive for autistic readers. Use alt text and image descriptions. Now, alt text appears when an image won't load, and the description will be read out by screen readers. So make sure they're helpful for anyone who can't see the image. Make them really descriptive. We've already talked about subtitles. Transcripts go a bit further. They can include the spoken words, but also some description of the visuals to help people who may not be able to see that footage or that image to properly understand the context of the words that are in there. You'd consider whether you might need to make alternative formats available. And if you're talking about people in your piece, just as you should make sure to spell their name correctly, do remember to check their pronouns and use them correctly. And if you're making visuals, whether that's photographs, video or graphics, remember to represent a range of identities in there. So there's a wealth of information on inclusive communications, and it can seem overwhelming, but please do take the time to get familiar with the basics to make your communications as inclusive as you can. Other important things to consider: copyright. When someone creates content, whether that's a piece of writing, a photograph, a sound file, or some artwork, the copyright automatically resides with the creator. Under UK law, they don't have to do anything to register for it. And it counts for a social media post every bit as much as a published work. So if you find some content on the web or in your Twitter feed that you want to reuse, you need to check for the usage rights. If it doesn't say you can use it, then you can't. It sounds simple enough, but in a world where content is generated and reshared at a furious rate, it's easy to forget. If you're creating content and putting it online, it's easiest for everyone if you can make it clear whether it can be reused or not, and if so, how it should be attributed. And you're probably familiar with the Creative Commons licensing that makes it easy for content creators to share work and make it known how the work should be attributed. And there's over 1 billion resources available under Creative Commons, so it's a fantastic resource. And yeah, just as you would cite references when writing a report or paper, you should do the same in other forms of science communication, but that could be more informal, such as a further reading list at the end of a blog, a soundtrack citation at the end of your video, or tagging relevant people in your social media posts. And make sure that your image credits are next to the relevant images. And Jason's already talked about the model permissions. So if you've got recognizable people in your images, you need to get permissions. But if you've got wide shots of a group when kind of no one's in focus and no one can really be recognized, you won't need that permission. So that's something to bear in mind when you're framing your pictures. So this is the list of resources that I promised. It's far from exhaustive, but these are some of the sites with free options that I've found useful. These links will be available in the PDF of the slides. But if you've got other favourites, perhaps you could share them in the chat and we could add those in. So we've covered a lot of ground in this webinar. So here's a quick recap to get you started. And most importantly is remember to have some fun with it. Be authentic, and your passion for what you're communicating will shine through, and that can be infectious. So we hope that's given you plenty of inspiration to go out and start communicating your science in new ways. We do have time, I think, to take just a couple of questions. We're probably close to the hour, but if we can take a couple of questions. And while you're doing that, I think Christy's going to put up another poll to gather your thoughts. And do have a think about making a video or writing a blog for the CIEEM website. And that's us. How are we doing on questions, Christy?
Oh, yes. So we've got a question here. Is asking for feedback from audiences seen as an important part of the process of producing science communications? This could include what the audience thought of the communication itself, how they think they might respond to the message included in the communication.
Yeah, I guess it depends on the communication. Yeah, it's always good to start with a test audience. I think if you've got, I mean, you're not going to get a lot of feedback from your cactus, but if you've got people to test it on in advance, then that can be useful. But yeah, I don't know whether Jason, Amber, if you've got any thoughts on that.
I suppose it adds to the review process. I know that it's as you're doing it right there and then, but it's always something to learn from. So it does add to that iterative cycle of how you do things.
Yeah. That's a yes from us, yes.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. There's no more in the Q&A, but there's some questions in the chat. Greg has said, the presentation made the important points at the outset to know the audience and what they want. For example, do not automatically assume a video is better than static storyboard, whether work or socially related. I avoid videos as they may take several minutes to illustrate what can be graphically conveyed in seconds. In other words, do we need to be wary of online video overload for our potential audience?
I think so. Sometimes a video might show something more quickly or more accessibly than a long explanation. So it kind of depends what you're conveying. But you're right that, I mean, there's like I forget the statistics of how much video is uploaded to YouTube every day, but it's a lot. So yeah, you need to think about what's the most appropriate format for what you're trying to say. And if you can say it quicker in an infographic than a video, then that might be a better way to do it.
Great, thank you, Vicky. Sorry, my washing machine might be quite loud. Apologies. Jonathan said, sorry, I missed the beginning of the webinar. Was there any talk on using maps as a means of communication, either static maps such as in a PDF or more interactive maps and story maps that can be produced using tools such as ESRI or ArcGIS online?
No, we didn't talk about maps. But yeah, I guess, yeah, if you're talking about a place, you know, a site or something, then that can be really important. I don't have a lot of experience with them myself. I've used QGIS a little bit for mapping. I don't know whether, Jason, have you got anything to add?
I was going to say, I think maps can be really useful. I think there's a distinction between it being an illustrative purpose. Apologies, the leaf blower guy's literally outside the window here. I think there's a difference between there being, and it comes back to a point that was made earlier around ecological reports as well, about whether that's part of your evidence and whether you're illustrating that, or whether it's setting a scene almost for where something is or what's happening. But I think maps can be a really important element of communication. Yeah, just going back to Rosie's point about ecological reports, I think there's a distinction between science communication more generally and trying to tell a story, and ecological reports, which are basically evidence. So you just need to make that distinction. Does it add to your evidence, or is it trying to tell a story? So I think there are different things. If you're going to add an image to an ecological report, it needs to be adding to the evidence, it needs to be showing something rather than trying to tell a story. Can I just pick up one other thing quickly before, because there seems to be quite a few questions coming in now. Greg mentioned one about Lush and social media channels and whether they are ethical or not, and that is a conversation that we are having internally, and we are keeping an eye on that. We don't quite have the luxury of being as big as Lush, where we can just decide to step away from everything and hope that everyone still remembers who we are. So we understand that point, and it is something that we are keeping in mind.
Great, thank you, Jason. So Andrew says, measuring impact of message, measuring reach is relatively easy. How do you suggest measure impact?
Again, it depends on the communication. It's whether you want to think about the number of likes or something on a social media post, or if you've got a call to action where it's names on a petition or bookings on an event or something, it's very easy. But yeah, I don't know. Again, Jason or Amber, whether you've got any thoughts on that?
I don't know whether Amber wants to add anything, but from our perspective, this is something that we grapple with a lot with policy. Is, we can do an awful lot in terms of activity with policy, but how do we measure that actual impact? And it comes back to, what are you trying to achieve? So your messaging is about putting it out there, but what is it you actually want to achieve, and is that happening? So you need to work out what it is that you want people to do. So like Vicky says, is if you want people to sign up to a pledge or something, how many people are actually signing up to that pledge? Yeah, you need to have something right up front that you want people to do, and that's the thing then to measure.
And I think sometimes there just isn't anything to measure. If you're just communicating about this cool science that you're doing, you won't necessarily be able to measure that. So it's about being clear up front, what you're trying to achieve.
I think just to give some examples of in the past, what we've looked at for policy is whether our messages have been picked up by other media. and whether our questions have been raised in Parliament or whether we've been invited to comment on something based on previous expertise that we've been given. So sort of the knock-on effects from the actions that you've taken as well, just keeping an eye on those, and maybe setting up, you can set up Google alerts for if your organisation has been mentioned, and they'll send you an email to say it has been, so that's a good way of monitoring.
Yeah, those Google alerts are really helpful for, I have those every day. I think we've over the hour now. I wonder if there's more kind of questions in the chat, maybe we can try and answer those in writing with a follow-up email to people.
Yeah, I think that'd be a good idea.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And just so you know, Vicky, the results of the poll is on the screen if you want to have a look.
Ah, I've just spotted that. Oh, that's great. We look forward to seeing some of these communications go out. Videos, graphic recording, yeah. And if anyone wants to tag me in on social media, I'm Vicky_Boskill. It'd be great to see what you're putting out now.
Okay, I think we might have come to the end then. So thank you very much, Vicky, for your presentation, and Jason for your information on photography. That was really, really useful for myself, who's also interested in photography. And thank you for everyone for being really active in the chat and submitting your questions. And as Vicky just said, we'll follow up and answer the ones that we didn't get to in an email when we send around the slides and the recording. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.